We often love to celebrate people who are considered the first generation of something, and it is something to be celebrated. But we often don't take stock of all the other underlying things that comes with being the first in a particular situation. If you're the first generation to go to college, or the first generation to graduate from college, or the first generation to move to a particular professional endeavor or cultural space, there's a lot of things that comes underneath this that we often don't talk about, whether it be culture shock or imposter syndrome, or just learning how to navigate in these spaces where no one before us could give us guidance in terms of how to effectively navigate those spaces. That can be inherently terrifying. Imagine if this is happening for an entire generation. Then things take on a different vibe. It's important to remember that even though a lot of our parents as Black Generation X, our parents from the baby boomers and the silent generation were destroying barriers and crashing into these spaces, a lot of times we were the first group as Black Generation X to collectively be moving into spaces for the first time. So as such, we were the first generation, not just merely going to college and so forth, but merely going into a lot of spaces where we didn't have people in our lives who actively knew how to navigate in those spaces. So what does that mean for Black Generation X when we are now considered the first, going into spaces and laying the foundation and understanding what the challenges that we experienced, knowing that we were going in where we were creating the blueprint because there was no blueprint for us? So let's go ahead and lay the foundation of what being a first generation actually means. A lot of times when we talk about it, first generation typically is looked through the lens of no one else prior to you generationally has ever done what you're about to do. And it can be a variety of instances. It can be the first generation, somebody going to the military, first generation, somebody going to a particular trade school. But for my example, I'm going to talk about it from the collegiate ranks, the first one to go into college, or even particularly the first person in your generation to go to a particular type of college, or the first person in your generation to go through a particular space in terms of going to college. And you're saying, what do you mean by a particular space? Well, you may have family members who've gone to college. You may have family members who, if you're a Black Generation X, who've gone to predominantly white institutions. But you might not have had family members who have left the state to go to college. You might not have had family members who've left the state to go to a particular type of college. You may have had family members who've gone to public institutions but never gone to a private institution. All of these things are important to recognize that if you're the first generation to do any of those things, you don't have a roadmap. You don't have a blueprint. You may have some people who can give you some insight and guidance based on their experiences under the circumstances that they went. But because you have a more nuanced experience, you may not have a lot of guidance. And this is important to recognize because, for instance, as I've indicated before, for Black Generation X, we were coming into this place where we were welcomed, presumably, welcomed into all these various spaces where we previously had not been. Remember, even though there were some baby boomers and some silent generations who were moving into these spaces after having years of dealing with segregation, they had to deal with the consequences of not necessarily being welcomed in those spaces. So they still had to deal with that tension. Our generation was supposedly the first generation that were being ushered in, where we were supposed to be welcomed in these spaces, but we didn't necessarily know all the challenges of those spaces. So therefore, as the first generation, we often, especially Black Generation X, found ourselves moving into a lot of spaces, and I'm going to use college as an example, where even if we had people in our family who had those experiences, they may not necessarily have the unique, nuanced experience of what we were going through. So I want to use the context of my experiences as an example. I attended the University of Tampa, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, let's kind of put the context. We're talking 1987. The University of Tampa is a small, private liberal arts school nestled in the heart of downtown Tampa, next to a very affluent community, Hyde Park. At the time, the University of Tampa was, if I remember correctly, and I may be wrong, and my fellow alumni will correct me, it was one of the most expensive schools in the state of Florida at the time, if I remember correctly. The school was about 95% white, with a very healthy population of students, primarily, of course, from Florida, but a great deal of them from the Northeast and from Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean. Now, that was the landscape of going into. In addition to, the school was I had a variety of historical landmarks on it and a variety of connection with other elite institutions like Ivy League schools because they would do partnerships with each other on a regular basis. This was the landscape that I was walking onto. But what I came from was very different. I had been around the college before, but my reference point was the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. UAPB, as it's referred to, is a historically black college university. It's the largest in the state of Florida, in the state of Arkansas, and it is the oldest in the state of Arkansas. And a great deal number of my family members actually attended there. My mom graduated from there. And so I grew up in an environment where I was used to going to a lot of functions on the campus. I went to homecomings on a regular basis. That was my reference point. And even my high school experience my high school at the time was one of the largest in the state. And as such, I was familiar with kind of being in a big school environment. My class was probably but my school was somewhere between 1,600, 2,000 students. So I had that reference point of I was growing up in the rural South. I was exposed to college through HBCUs. I went to a high school that had kind of a big school appeal to it, in a city that was about 75% black. So all of those things were my reference point. And that was what was kind of shaping me when I found myself going to the University of Tampa. When I got to the University of Tampa, this was a culture shock for me in a variety of different ways. And here was a couple of contexts. First, in terms of my immediate family members, I was going away further than anybody else at that particular point in time. And so I was the first generation to not only go the furthest to college, but also the only one who had ever matriculated at a predominantly white institution that was a private affluent school. And so I had no idea what I was going to be exposed to. And there were shocks that I didn't anticipate. I ran into various, cultural struggles, here and there. Like I can still remember having this battle with my roommates because, I had a laundry bag full of clothes because I hadn't washed clothes. I had clean clothes, but it was my laundry bag was getting bigger and bigger. And there was this concern that my laundry was getting out of control. But what they didn't realize is that it was getting out of control because I didn't have money to get my clothes washed. And they didn't understand what that context looked like. And also, when I was there in the campus, I came with a duffel bag full of clothes. That was it. And so when I got there, I'm in this environment and I'm in a co-ed dorm and I'm watching my roommates get a microwave, my roommates get a small refrigerator. I'm watching young ladies in other rooms get, telephones for their rooms because that was a big thing back then. I'm watching people move in particular ways that I just could not relate to, primarily because from a financial standpoint, I came from a single parent household with a mother who was a teacher. And so her resources in terms of her ability to support me was extremely limited. But I'm sitting here at the same time watching all this unfold. And while they were traveling back and forth, if they had to go home, if they were in state, they were driving the car. But if they were out of state, almost everybody was flying. I was riding the bus. And so all of these things amplified to me that I felt that I was very out of place. And let me make this point abundantly clear. No one made me feel like I was out of place. Nobody came up to me and consciously said, dude, you wash your clothes, you ain't got any money. What's that about? Nobody said anything like that. But at the same time, I often didn't communicate to anybody that was my circumstances because in my mind, I told myself, this is the price of what it means to be here. Is I've got to figure out how to make this work. And unfortunately, what it meant was that making it work meant that I did not look to resources both on campus or out of campus to help me survive. Because again, no one had educated me. I didn't have any blueprint for how to navigate this. Now, there are going to be people going to say, you didn't call your mama? I said, again, in my mind, my mom struggled just to even help me get there. And so I didn't want to be a burden. And I felt as a young adult, this is what young adults do. You get yourself out of situations you get yourself into. Again, this is coming from a person who does not have a blueprint. And as I'm walking into this affluent campus, dealing with people who, in my view, weren't similarly situated as I was. They were not, and I'm not saying that I wasn't as smart as them, because I will say I am. I wasn't saying that I wasn't as forward moving as them, because I was. But in terms of just the socioeconomic standpoint, the cultural standpoint, all of those things were a shock. And so this was something that I had not uniquely been prepared for, but I had to adjust to over time. But then here was the other part of this. As I started to get comfortable in my own skin and finding out and evolving into becoming the person that I would be, because I did graduate from the University of Tampa, something happened that I didn't pay attention to. It didn't become relevant because I thought I was moving in a space a particular way, but I became aware of it. I became aware of it when I started noticing the powerful singularity of being the only one. And you say, what do you mean? Well, in my ROTC class, in my specific class, I was the only black cadet. Not the only black male, the only black cadet in my class, which meant that when I graduated from the University of Tampa and I got commissioned as an Army officer, I was the only black person in my class to get commissioned. That's it. And I didn't really focus on that when I was coming through saying, oh, I'm the only black one. But every now and then, I wasn't lost on me that I was the only one. Same thing. When I graduated with a degree in biology, I was the only black male with a degree in biology. I think it was a couple of other young ladies, at least one or two black females, but I was the only black male. We had residence assistants. Coming into my class, I was the only black male. Excuse me, I was the only black. So even it's funny because by the time I graduated, because I was one of the few who had the opportunity to be an RA as a sophomore, junior, and a senior, my senior year, there were still only a handful of blacks. I was the only black male that actually had been an RA for 3 years. And so now you're in the situation where there's people who are probably sitting here saying to themselves, why are you dwelling on all this? And something, because it's not a dwell. It's the reality that a lot of people of Black Generation X, and I'm going to say, yes, prior generations, and even today, but this was even more magnified because this was a point where I was coming into it. All these things stood out. I was in an affluent university that was predominantly white, and there were so many spaces where I was the only one. Again, I have to stress, nobody made me feel bad about being the only one. But there were times where I was cognizant of the fact that I was moving in a space where there was no one else that looked like me. And I didn't always know what to do with that information. And there's going to be people out there say, oh, that's a problem. We're all together. I said, well, the reality is that I had my own unique challenges that I had to face. But because it was just me, I didn't necessarily know who I could turn to that could help me navigate those things, particularly because I was the only one in each one. And I think what often gets lost in this time is that when you are the first generation, I'm not saying this for everyone because I'm pretty sure there's more than enough people out there that are confident in how they maneuver. I wasn't. And there were times that I wondered if I deserved to be there. Now, there are going to be people say, wait a minute, because you were black. No, pause. What I'm saying by this is that when I'm moving in these spaces and I'm cognizant of the fact that I am not similarly situated, not only from a race standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint or a socioeconomic standpoint, I am struggling to find something normal to latch on to that helps entrench me into what I need to do to make sure I matriculate. And it's funny because one of my good friends indicated to me that she said that there were classmates of ours who never said this to me, who were always enamored by my work ethic. Like they were sitting here just mind blown by the fact that I was an RA, that I was on ROTC scholarship, that I was doing college work study because I worked at the front desk while at the same time being an RA and an ROTC, and that they were enamored by the fact that that I would pay for my way going back and forth, and I would ride a bus home and everything. And in their mind, they're looking at me and they're going, "Man, this guy is really about that thing." And what they didn't realize is that this was my way of surviving, and this was my way of finding some normalcy into what I was doing. And this was crucial for me. And it was funny because while there may be people around me who celebrated the fact that they looked at me and said, this is a guy who is maximizing his college experience, what they didn't realize is that this was a guy who was struggling internally with trying to ensure he deserved to be there. And it wasn't because any person told me, black boy, you wouldn't deserve to be there. No, or anybody who was rich or had money said, you don't deserve to be here. It was all of these things were nonverbal cues signaling to my brain that I had to work harder so I could matriculate through this, because this school wasn't necessarily designed for the type of student that I am in mind. And here is the dilemma of being a member of First Generation X, is that we celebrate the milestones, we celebrate the accomplishments, and we celebrate the reality of what they are, but we don't think about the fact that what does it mean to be in these spaces? Because it's not enough to be in those spaces. You also want to be able to matriculate through those spaces. And that became a big focal point for me, so that this way I could look back and say, I validated my existence because I was able to successfully get through, while at the same time not figuring out how to maximize the fact that I was in such a unique space because I was first generation. But what I didn't realize is that the knowledge that I was experiencing would benefit future generations. I can still remember when I had the opportunity to mentor some of my younger fraternity brothers, probably around 2004, 2005, and so forth like that. And I gave them my insight because at that time I was a young lawyer, and I was, explaining to them about how to navigate certain things professionally. But what I also didn't appreciate until they started asking me was their hunger to get an idea of what life was like when I was there by myself. And getting the understanding that, I wasn't the only Black person on campus. I had a variety of Black friends, African American, African Caribbean, Afro, Central American. I had a variety of them. So I wasn't like I was just sitting here in the corner by myself, sucking my thumb. But what I realized also was that the blueprint that they would benefit from was from the one that I created. I'm not saying that they had to come to me and say, what do I need to do if I'm going to the school? No, the blueprint is not merely about where you start. It's about giving you the guidepost along the way. And like one of the biggest things that I remember was one of my young brothers wanted to do something. He wanted to get Judge Mathis to come down as a keynote speaker for Black History Month. And I remember all of the things that the university did for me when I was a part of a minority organization and for the organization to make things happen. So I was able to share with that brother, hey, this is what you should think about doing, because the university has a long-standing history of supporting minority issues if you direct them in terms of where they can help you. He didn't believe it until he put it in an application, and that's exactly what they did. So not only was that the case, the university paid for this guy to come down, but because I was a member of a law firm, I was able to convince my law firm to host a reception for him. And so literally they were like, wow, this is great. It was great because they had the blueprint of what I went through to help them put on their events. And they were also able to benefit from the fact that everything I did to get myself in this position, they could also take advantage of as well. They were the future generation that benefited from the generational knowledge that I had attained. And so I could share that going forward. And this is not uniquely just for me. Black Generation X, because we were the first, and I have shared this in multiple videos about how we were the first to move into all this society that our parents and our grandparents had not. We also were the ones who were drawing the blueprints, laying the foundation for future generations. And so this is why it was so important for us going forward, that it's not about just getting to those spaces, but moving through those spaces as we are charting through our trials and tribulations and our mistakes as to what should happen for future generations so that they can learn from the mistakes, the successes, and the failures that we experience. It's extremely important to remember that being a first generation is not about a milestone. It's about responsibility. When somebody signals that they're the first generation, they inherently know they are the ones that are laying the blueprint. They are the ones that are setting forth the parameters for what future generations can benefit. Never discount the fact that if you have someone that you know is a first generation of anything, they are walking into this knowing that they are the ones that are going to be teaching future generations, because no one is going to be there to teach them. And as a member of Black Generation X, we learned this collectively, as we are now finding ourselves in real time in a position of having to shape future generations based on all of the things that we experienced. And we hope that they can learn from what we went through. I don't know if you know it, but there's always a background and a reason behind I do most of my stories, or most of the content that I do. And if you want to know more about it, I got membership groups. Did you know that? And it has members only shorts or members only video, inside commentary, special behind the look scenes, all of these extra toys so that you can get an appreciation of what was the motivating factor behind the content I produce. If you ever watch my content and you want it more, this is for you.